The US warns it could pull its support for the YPG if they mobilize to take on Turkey. Could Washington be stepping back from its policy of supporting foreign fighters? I'm Imran Garta, and today's newsmaker is American proxy wars. Turkish troops and the Free Syrian Army are advancing on YPG positions in northern Syria as Operation Olive Branch pushes through its first week. The mission pits Turkey against its fellow NATO ally, the United States, which supports the YPG in the fight against Daesh. But in an effort to prevent a proxy war spiraling out of control, the US has told YPG fighters not to engage Turkey. It seems like a big turnaround for Washington, which just a week ago wanted to build a YPG-led border force. So, is the US reevaluating its strategy of supporting foreign militias? Sandra Gatman has more.
It's often said that the enemy of your enemy is your friend. And in the fight against Daesh, the U.S. has used that to full effect.
The U.S. is in Syria to defeat ISIS. We've done that with a coalition of partners and the Syrian Democratic Forces in particular, which are comprised of Kurdish and Arab, but also elements of Christian forces.
The problem for Washington is that that ally is mainly comprised of the YPG. They're connected to the PKK terror group, which has led a decades-old insurgency in Turkey.
Is it surprising to you that the Turks may be upset with us by arming the YPG in Syria, since they're so closely aligned with the PKK?
No, it's not. No, it's not at all, Senator. We have extensively just clarified. Let me just say that, and the chairman's been involved in this as well. We have extensive consultations with the Turks.
So Turkey's okay with this?
They're not okay with that.
I just got back from Turkey. They're not okay with this. No. They think this is the dumbest idea in the world, and I agree with them.
At one point, the quick solution seemed to be new branding.
So we literally played back to them that, hey, you got to change your brand. You know, what do you want to call yourself besides the YPG? And with about a day's notice, they declared that they were the Syrian Democratic Forces. I thought it was a stroke of brilliance to put democracy in there somewhere.
But Turkey says it won't be fooled. When the U.S. announced plans to bolster YPG forces in Syria, Turkey launched a military offensive to push them back from their border. The U.S. has a history of using local insurgents to fight wars abroad. In the 1980s, America funded and trained Afghan mujahideen to fight the Soviet Union. Years later, some of those fighters turned their fury on America as Al-Qaeda. In Nicaragua, Contra rebels fighting the Sandinistas in power also got American aid.
With their blood and courage, the freedom fighters of Nicaragua have pinned down the Sandinista army and bought the people of Central America precious time. We Americans owe them a debt of gratitude.
And yet, helping the Contras eventually sparked resentment across the continent for American-sponsored regime change. The CIA is also accused of covertly training Buddhist guerrillas to fight in Tibet. But is targeting communists and terrorists using armed proxies a safe exercise? When it comes to the YPG, Turkey says you can't use terrorists to fight terrorists, forcing the U.S. to make the ultimate choice, risk losing its surrogates or a NATO ally. Sandra Gatman, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Paris is Peter Galbraith. He's a former U.S. diplomat who advised the Kurds during negotiations on Iraq's constitution. From Washington, D.C., we have Mark Kimmett. He's a retired brigadier general who served as a U.S. spokesman during the Iraq War. And with me here in Istanbul is Meryem İlayda Atlas. She's the editorial director of the pro-government Turkish newspaper Daily Sabah. I thank you all for joining us. Meryem, let me begin with you. Coming out of the Pentagon, the spokesperson saying, with regards to the YPG, if they carry out military operations of any kind that are not specifically focused on ISIS or Daesh, they will not have coalition support. Let's say, for example, a unit of YPG says, hey, we'll no longer fight ISIS and we're going to support our brothers in Afrin. Then they are on their own. They are not our partners anymore. Do you accept that as reasonable, and do you accept that as a change of policy?
Well, this is something U.S. is keeps saying from the very beginning. We are not in a sort of direct intervention in Syria, civil war or something, but we are only fighting with Daesh, and we are asking for Turkish forces as well as Syrian army and YPG to focus on fighting with ISIS. This is something their policy, and the armament of the YPG was reasoned behind this policy making. And they told that you have to go to war in the field with ISIS, and then after that we will stop giving arms to YPG. And this was a sort of guarantee that Trump also said in a phone call to President Erdogan. This is something, yes, seems reasonable, but by saying this, both the Turkish side and the YPG have to focus on fighting with Daesh. It seems that U.S. has very little understood the Turkish concerns in the field. And I think it is not a good idea to say that giving heavy military, arming people, training them, which is called by the Turkish side as terrorists, and then at one point saying that, okay, after defeating Daesh in Syria, we will stop giving arms and stop supporting, as you have said. And this is something not reasonable because...
Okay, so let me hold on there for a second. Let me bring in General Kimmitt. But General Kimmitt, I want you to listen to something. This is from YPG fighters themselves. This appeared on the BBC very recently. Have a little listen to this video.
They're all ready to go and fight in Afrin against the invading force of Turkey. We've been training for a significant amount of time. Tactics that work against any force. We're prepared, and we've been supplied by the YPG to fight against Turkish terrorists.
Okay, so Mark Kimmitt, we have this video with YPG fighters, American accented, we don't know their nationality. They're saying, we're going to Afrin, we're going to fight for the YPG against the Turkish forces. And on the other hand, the Pentagon spokesman saying, if any of that is done, they lose our support. What's going on?
Well, again, I think it's important to understand, Imran, that the U.S. policy remains and the U.S. authority remains to fight ISIS and ISIS only inside of Syria. We don't have the authority to fight the Assad regime. These forces are focused on the Assad regime. That's why we're not going to support them. It's unfortunate because the Kurds are our allies, but we are there for one purpose, along with our coalition partners, and that's the defeat of ISIS. That's our intent, and frankly, that's the only authority that we have inside of Syria right now.
Peter Galbraith, is it worth all the trouble locking horns with Turkey by arming and funding and training the YPG and bringing Turkey into the battlefield now as they are doing so in Afrin?
Well, first, I think it's important to understand the history of this. It was Turkey's inaction at the time of the attack on Kobani, which threatened to have thousands of people massacred, that led the United States to intervene militarily on behalf of the YPG. And then I think the Americans discovered that the YPG were by far and away the most effective fighters against the Islamic State. As the general said, these people have been America's allies. They've been effective fighters. To be honest, Turkey has been a very inconsistent ally in this whole struggle. And a lot of Americans are also concerned about the authoritarian tendencies that are going on in Turkey. And this attack on Afrin really is something that I think concerns people who worry about human rights. I want to say something, though, a little different from what the General Kimmitt said, which is the Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, articulated a new purpose to the American presence in Syria in support of the YPG or the SDF, which is we are there to protect them against the Assad regime. And the other point is that in Afrin, they are not fighting against the Assad regime. They're fighting, on the one hand, against the Turkish army, which has crossed into Syria, and on the other hand, they're fighting against the Free Syrian Army, which has also been supported by the United States, as well as some Turkish-supported groups like the Har-Sham and Jabhat al-Nusra.
Okay, so, I mean, and that's interesting. Is there any evidence that Turkey supports Jabhat al-Nusra?
there's evidence over the years that there's been Turkish support for it, including pretty easy transit point for international fighters that have gone into Syria. I don't think that's in serious dispute.
Yeah, but you're making a pretty large claim. I mean, there's Ahrar al-Sham, there's the Free Syrian Army and so on, but Turkey supporting al-Qaeda is a pretty big claim. Does that really check out? Are you absolutely certain of that?
Well, I will say that Syria has been pretty open about support for some of these groups, and there's a lot of suspicion that it has provided elements of support to some of these groups.
Suspicion.
Ahrar al-Sham is also pretty extreme.
Okay, fair enough, but there is clearly a difference between al-Qaeda and Ahrar al-Sham. Let me then ask you, as a former ambassador, are you comfortable for the inevitability, given that the YPG is the sister organization of the PKK, that's indisputable, and the PKK is listed as a terror organization by Washington and others, are you prepared for the inevitability that those arms, those weapons will be turned on NATO ally by terrorist group, the PKK, eventually? Are you happy with that eventually happening?
Of course not. But I'm not convinced that it will happen. I've been into Syrian Kurdish areas 10 times since 2014. And there's no doubt that there is a connection between the people there and the PKK. On the other hand, it's actually also quite different from the PKK. It's established what is a de facto a self-governing area. And when that happens, an organization has to change for its purpose. It is the government of the area. It has the United States, and not just the United States, but Britain and France, among others, as its allies. I think I know that there's an awareness talking to them that it's not in their interest for these weapons to be used by the PKK because, I mean, just from even logically, they aren't going to do much damage to Turkey, but they will invite retribution and they will jeopardize the support they have. So there's an awareness of that. And I think that Turkey might also rethink its position. If you go back to 1991 and even after that, Turkey took a totally hostile view to the Kurdish enclave in northern Iraq, and yet eventually it ended up supporting it against Iraq. It's quite possible that if Turkey took a less belligerent attitude toward what the Kurds in Syria, they might end up having a better relationship, and it might actually help restart the peace process in Turkey, which was rather recklessly broken by Erdogan.
Okay, so let me ask Miriam. Miriam, what do you make of Ambassador Galbraith's comments here, saying that Turkey should have done better at the beginning, for example, with Kobani, and maybe now it needs to be a bit more flexible and not hard-headed when it looks at the situation in the north of Syria?
Ambassador Galbraith first makes something clear that how American side is deaf and how little they understand the situation and reality Turkey is in. Of course, there is a history. In all of the 2014 and 15, we have already spent a lot of time on Turkey supporting ISIS, Turkey's providing arms and this and that. So this was all of the 2014 and 15, how Daesh became very powerful entity in Syria was passed with the very little understanding of what is going in the region. So we have seen that Turkey is an ally of NATO, which has claimed that every right to keep its security border. This is a claim coming from European Union, from many countries, from United States and different authorities. So we are here talking about Turkey as doing something little in Kobani, which is also very little understanding, because I was in Kobani at that time in 2014 and I was in Suruc, and I have witnessed that 200,000 people just came into Turkey and people were just on the streets. It was only in 2 weeks. So the inability, starting from second Obama administration and indecisiveness and America's unilaterality in international relations is reflecting as a superpower. America is not taking the action and do not have a motivation to solve the international crisis while they are fighting too much over their domestic problems. Okay, and then so now being an ally to the non-state actor would create bigger causes. As you have said, just one thing, if you provide to a terror group or a non-state actor that doesn't have a regular army, You provide heavy artillery, train these people, provide military equipment. Then what are you going to do with these people? As happened in Afghanistan, as we have seen Mujahideen supporting some groups that can also turn back against America. That's okay, you can disable some heavy military installments and crafts, but what are you going to do with all of the equipments? Equipments are also very important for militaries to survive, for people, fighting people to survive. So what are you going to do with this training and know-how?
So let's take that and lob it at General Kimmitt. Mark Kimmitt, you said that the sole objective is fighting ISIS, right? It's fighting Daesh. And I guess politically, you arm a bad guy to kill a worse guy, and it's been happening since time immemorial. Are you afraid of blowback? Are you afraid of an Afghanistan-type situation?
I'm really not. But first of all, if you'll give me some latitude, I'd like to correct two issues that have been said. Number one, Imran, you said that there is indisputable evidence that the YPG is connected to the PKK. That is disputable.
It's indisputable.
Were the United States be...
Certainly. I mean,
it is not. The United States... let me finish.
Okay, go ahead.
If it was indisputable, then the United States military would be in violation of Title 18 of the United States Code. We would be, in effect, providing material support to a foreign terrorist organization through the YPG.
When they took over Raqqa and they put Öcalan's picture out there...
Let me finish.
When they put Öcalan's picture there, or his huge banner in Raqqa, what was that about? They were just fans?
Again, if the YPG was in direct support of the PKK, the United States would be in violation of U.S. law. The lawyers have determined that issue about it is... Well, if that's the case, then you should bring a suit into federal court. Now, on the second, if I may finish...
Okay, but PYD, I just one question. PYD militants are, sending and freeing the ISIS militants in Raqqa. Have you ever seen this video by BBC? So what is your answer for this? So I'm sorry for asking a question.
And if I may finish my original point, listen, Ambassador Galbraith has a distinguished diplomatic career. I never want to take on a fight with a person talking about State Department issues. But what I heard Secretary Tillerson say with the new policy is that we would be using these elements of the YPG as part of a stabilization force inside the area east of the Euphrates. I don't think we are in anticipation that those forces would be used in a defense east of the Euphrates against Syrian forces. We have no mandate and we have no authority to fight the Syrian regime at this point. So I think we just need to clarify what we consider to be indisputable and what we consider to be disputable.
Okay, Peter Galbraith.
Well, General Kimmitt and I heard the Secretary of State differently because I did hear him say when he was out at the Hoover Institute that in California that the U.S. was going to be there to protect this area against the Assad regime, in addition to being there to combat the Islamic State. Look, in terms of blowback, you can make criticisms of the PYD. You can argue that it's certainly not part of the PKK. You can say that they put up a poster of Öcalan. There are posters of Öcalan there. But in terms of blowback, these are not Islamists. These are followers of somebody from my own state, Murray Bookchin, and they're very much in belief of things like gender equality. They're women fighters. They're women generals. They have female co-prime ministers.
Are you telling me that Marxists never killed anybody in history because they're not Islamist? So because they're Marxists and not Islamists, they're okay.
Karl Marx or this whole system's been gone. The Cold War's been over for some time. I actually know this area pretty well. I could say that, to your Turkish colleague who was there, perhaps she doesn't understand it very well. But they were certainly the PKK certainly were once Marxist. Öcalan was a Stalinist, but their thinking has changed. It doesn't mean that you would want to embrace them, but parts of what they do are interesting, very secular, certainly very empowering of women, and they, unlike the Iraqi Kurds who speak of Kurdistan, they actually try to maintain a multi-ethnic, multi-religious place. You know, they perhaps are not as democratic as they might be. But what they're doing is interesting, and I don't think that one needs to be worried about blowback, that they're going to try and, you know, go back and reignite a Marxist revolution any place in the world, because, hey, that ideology's dead, and they're not going to become Islamists because they're about as anti-Islam as they could be.
Miriam, okay. Miriam, let me ask you about
anti-Islamic extremist, I should say.
Let me ask you, Miriam, let me add to that, and then you can sort of fold it into your answer. Let me ask you about the possibility of Turkey getting sucked into a protracted conflict, because out of the, say, 30,000 SDF forces maybe being trained, the estimates are about 10,000 are sort of hardcore YPG. That's a lot of fighters. They know the terrain. Is there a possibility that Turkey might get sucked into a battle that they can't win easily?
Well, it won't be easy, of course, but I want to ask you a question about BBC's video. It was last month, showing that these ISIS militants were released by PYD militants.
Certainly, but
freely and in a very peaceful. This is a question that I want to raise because it is.
Can we do it very briefly? Can we do it very briefly? Because then I think we're getting a bit distracted. But Ambassador Galbraith, do you want to address the idea or the claim that PYD had released Daesh fighters? And I just want to park this off as soon as you answer it. So go ahead, Ambassador Galbraith.
I don't know, and I have to say, with the connection, I didn't hear the question very easily. But I think your question's a very good one, and I think Turkey, which doesn't have a lot of experience at fighting, protracted battles.
It was a question you asked
may find that when it's hard for any military to go into another country and to take on hardened fighters, so they might find it surprisingly hard. I can say, as an American, we've often assumed that some of these conflicts would be easy, and they've turned out to be a lot tougher than we thought.
General Kimmitt, we have these de-escalation zones elsewhere in the country, in places like Idlib. Are those going to all unravel now because of the conflict in the north? Because we see Washington and Ankara and Moscow on opposite sides of this particular conflict, but all on the same page when it comes to the de-escalation zones.
Well, I don't think it's going to unravel, but I do agree with Ambassador Galbraith that wars are easy to start, but they're tough to end. But look, there's a tremendous incentive, particularly with the Sochi process being led in the main by the Russians. There is a tremendous incentive on the part of all parties to move beyond the military conflict and onto the diplomatic portion of this campaign. Unfortunately, it has been interrupted by this preoccupation of Turkey on this fight within Afrin. But I think for the rest of the country, there seems to be an understanding of the status quo, the de-escalation zones, as being instrumental to getting beyond the fighting on the ground to humanitarian relief, between a diplomatic solution between a post-Assad regime. So no, I don't see this system of de-escalation zones unraveling anytime soon.
And it's really interesting that everybody's sort of agreeing that Syria's sovereignty argument doesn't really fly anymore, because they lost the right to talk about their sovereignty a long time ago as this war has gone on and everybody has been involved. Let me ask you very finally, Miriam, if you'll allow me, what would success be? Is success just knocking out the YPG and creating that 30-kilometer long buffer zone, as President Erdogan and Prime Minister Yildirim have spoken about? Is it more than that? Is it setting up some sort of alternate structure? And that might be treated like an occupation by some. What is success in terms of Turkey's actual end game in the north of Syria?
Turkey is very consistent and open and very clear in this fight. In 2016, we have Euphrates Shield, and it was just stopped at some point when Turkey is satisfied that their goal has been reached. So this will happen unless creating a buffer zone and Turkey authorities will convince that the border is now secure, then they will treat back, of course. They firstly and cleanly said this, Turkey will no longer stay in Syria as an occupying force or as being some sort of creating an entity and state and this and that. They always talk about the unity of Syria, and that's why they are supporting Syrian democratic forces. And PYD is an open threat, and we know that there's a historical proof that they are offshoots of PKK in Kandil Mountains, and they were just a branch before the Syrian war. Then they became too powerful, independent, and as a non-state actor, they started to be backed by the United States. What is inconsistent and which is unclear and indecisive is the U.S. administration. Pentagon is saying something, White House is saying other thing, and Trump administration is saying other thing. So all people are confused and they controversial explanations. Former Vice President Joe Biden said last week in a conference, just like 10 days before, I don't remember, but he said that YPD should be in the eastern Euphrates. So means that, a vice president is talking about completely, now the Pentagon officials are saying this. So this is so confusing and creating an anger and frustration in the Turkish public. But Turkish idea is very much clear, that saying that there will be a buffer zone and they will be backing Syrian democratic forces.
But not those who call themselves Syrian democratic forces, who are the
Syrian army
democratic forces in Syria. Yes, Syria, I just want to clarify that with you. But
sorry for the confusion.
Miriam, Mark, and Peter, I thank you all for joining us. I've got to move on, but I really enjoyed this, and I thank you very much for joining us here on The Newsmakers. Coming up after the break, condemnation after Bahrain upholds a prison sentence for a prominent human rights activist. And we'll debate why a publisher in Hong Kong has once again been the target of Chinese police. Welcome back to The Newsmakers. Bahrain's foreign ministry has proclaimed that the country made great strides in preserving human rights and dignity. But critics have scoffed at the assertion, pointing to the jailing of human rights activist Nabil Rajab. A Bahraini court has upheld his 2-year prison sentence for criticizing the government. And another ruling on a similar charge next month could add another 15 years to his time behind bars. With more on this story, here's Vanessa Keneally.
President of the Bahrain Center for Human Rights, Nabil Rajab, showing support for his fellow political activist in 2016.
We have gathered today to welcome Sheikh Mohammed Ali Mahfouz, who is one of the figures who is a great leader who was behind bars as a reason for their struggle for human rights and democracy in this country.
This was just one of the many times the opposition leader has stood up for others, but it's landed him in jail more than once. Rajab was sent to Bahrain's Joe prison in 2012 and 2014, where he and human rights groups say he experienced demeaning treatment and is aware of others being beaten, humiliated and deprived of food. Something he worked hard to make known as soon as he was freed.
I have just been released about an hour ago by the Royal King's pardon, and I'm happy about this. I hope this will also include the release of all the prisoners, including political prisoners in Bahrain, because the crisis is not limited to imprisoning Nabil Rajab, but there are hundreds of political prisoners.
Then in July, Nabil was found guilty of spreading rumours and untruthful information against the Bahraini government in TV interviews. He also criticised Saudi Arabia on Twitter, condemning its airstrikes in Yemen. And he's not the only one in trouble for speaking his mind. According to independent watchdog Freedom House, Bahrain's democracy record has gotten worse since the Arab Spring Revolution of 2011. Those protests were put down after Bahrain's ruling family allowed Saudi troops into the country. Since then, people have been restricted from criticising Islam, the king, or advocating for a change in government. Journalists can also be in prison for libel, slander, and what the government considers a divulging of secrets. Human Rights Watch has spent years pressurising Gulf states to release those jailed for criticising their leaders, and has urged people like EU Foreign Policy Chief Federica Mogherini to intervene. But so far it hasn't made things any easier for people like Rajab. Last week, a Bahraini court upheld his 2-year sentence after an appeal by Rajab's defence team. He's also awaiting another sentence next month about comments he posted on Twitter, which could put him behind bars for 15 more years. Vanessa Keneally, The Newsmakers.
Well, with me here in the studio to discuss this is Mohammed Khalid Al Yahya. He's a fellow at the Atlantic Council's Rafiq Hariri Center for the Middle East. And joining us from London is Sayyid Ahmed Al Wadai. He's the Director of Advocacy at the Bahrain Institute for Rights and Democracy. Gentlemen, I thank you very much for joining us. Sayyid Ahmed Al Wadai, let me begin with you. Nabil Rajab, his sentence has been upheld. He also faces more charges, could be in jail for a long, long time. Did he receive a fair trial?
Well, I mean, if you just read the 2-year sentence verdict in itself, it's a textbook example of how the Bahraini courts are really suppressing the freedom of expression. And what Nabil stated, he stated the truth, and he exposed the torture in Bahrain, and he was doing his job as a human rights defender. The Bahraini rulers did not like this, and they put him in jail. The trial is nothing, but it's simply full of breaches. The United States representatives and a number of other Western states, including the United Kingdom and so on, they did observe the trial, and I think the United States explicitly stated it many times that there is no case and he should be released. That's surprisingly by Bahrain's strongest ally. It's not only by the time when Obama was in power. As a matter of fact, even under the Trump administration, this call was made. So I'm not talking about United Nations. I'm not talking about, any other foreign countries. I'm talking about the strongest allies to Bahrain, right. The United States.
Understood.
And the European Union most recently stated the same.
Okay, so Mohammed Al Yahya, in many ways, Bahrain is a progressive country. But here's a guy who disagrees with the government. He tweets a few things and he's banged up in jail for a long, long time. It doesn't sound like a place where you can speak freely or criticize the government at all.
I admit I haven't read the verdict of Nabil Rajab's case specifically, but I mean, all you have to do is look at the Bahrain inquiry report, the BICI, to look at the list of violations that happened in Bahrain. Bahrain is far from perfect. It has a long way to go in terms of implementing the recommendations that are in the BICI, but what's often ignored is the trans-regional aspect of Iran's equities and militias in the region. There are two...
And I'm going to get to Iran in a second, right? Yeah. But let's just talk about Rajab for a second, because he's speaking about torture, for example. You mentioned the BICI, which was commissioned by the Bahraini government. It was seen as this tremendous development where they're finally turning the mirror on themselves and they're going, okay, maybe we have done something wrong. Human Rights Watch saying the oversight bodies that the government set up in 2012 in response to a recommendation by the Bahrain Independent Commission of Inquiry failed to perform their stated mission of investigating credibly allegations of prison abuse. And here's a guy who says there's torture in this prison. I've been in that prison. I was in that prison. This is what I saw. This is what's happening. And he's facing, beyond the 2 years, 15 years in jail. So that has nothing to do with Iran whatsoever, right?
No, it doesn't.
That might be the climate or the context in the background explaining the paranoia. Is that wrong?
No, like I mentioned, I mean, if you look at the BICI report, it's very detailed in showing a number of violations. But the BICI report also mentions that there's no systematic policy of torture in Bahrain. We can debate now to what extent the Bahraini government has been successful in implementing the BICI. I haven't looked at that in detail. Apparently, there has been an ombudsman created recently to cover these issues. I haven't had the chance to assess to what extent that has succeeded. But the real problem here, and the real problem that is taking away from the efficacy of true defenders of rights and true activists in Bahrain, is that there are organized cells by Iran in that country in the same way that they exist in Iraq and in the same way that exist in Syria. Sarai al-Mukhtar and Sarai al-Ashtar, for example, have just been listed by the United States and the United Kingdom as terrorist entities. Hezbollah is active in Bahrain. There are fighters from Bahrain that have died in Iraq. What people always have to remember and what people fail to consider is that Iran has equities around the region and it reroutes resources. So in any case, removing that influence that Iran has on politics in Bahrain and elsewhere is a necessary step.
Yeah, but how do you remove Iran's influence by throwing people in jail for tweets after they criticized things that the government themselves have said is happening in the country?
It's not just Bahrain. Freedom of speech has lots of room for improvement in the entire region. I'm not a human rights expert, but what I can tell you is a few days ago, the Ministry of Interior in Bahrain released a statement showing that they caught a number of Bahrainis in the country that were involved in a bomb-making facility. They found hard drives. And you know, the problem is some of these recruits are 15 and 16 years old. People implicated in taking up arms.
So is it worth it? Okay, so before I bring you in, Saeed Ahmed Al-Wadai, let me ask you, Mohammed, is it worth it that some innocent people are going to be caught up under human rights abuses because of the Iranian threat?
I don't understand the question.
Because you're saying that, you're telling me, for example, with Nabil Rajab, well, I haven't really read much, you know, yes, I know it's not great, but the government's argument is that he's connected to this nefarious Iranian stuff.
I don't know.
And if there's no evidence against him, are you suggesting that maybe it's worth it? Some people are going to be caught up because human rights don't really. No, but in the region, it's not great.
What I mentioned is I hadn't read the verdict with Nabil Rajab. I don't know if it says that he's connected to Iran or if he's not connected to Iran. But take, for example, the case of Abdurrauf al-Shayeb. Abdurrauf al-Shayeb was involved in the February 14 movement, and he's in jail in the United Kingdom right now for having sniper manuals and manuals to make IEDs. This was found in his home in London, and he was an asylum seeker in that country. Okay. There are many groups that are equally
involved. So you're making the case.
Bird is one group.
Okay, so you're making the case for Iranian involvement.
No, that is under investigation right now by the Charity Commission in the UK. And this is comparable to Iran's activities with the narco trafficking that is a part and parcel of what is doing in Hezbollah.
Okay, so let me bring in Ahmed Al-Wadai.
It's something that's international, and that's something that has to be talked about.
Okay, so Saeed Ahmed Al-Wadai. The response from Mohammed is to say Bahrain's under threat from the Iranians, and you have to understand all of this through that prism. Tell me what your response is.
Well, my response is to be the most abusive regimes on earth, and if you just wanted to see where Bahrain is right now, look into the index by, say, all rights groups. Look into Freedom House, for instance, which will describe the country as not a free country. You look into what Reporters Without Borders, when they look into the situation of journalists and how they get kicked out of the country, get imprisoned for tweets and so on. So you talk about one of the most repressive regimes on earth. They've been committing crimes of right, starting from systematic torture, murdering people on the street, killing innocent civilians, executing individuals based on unfair trial, things which United Nations, for instance, would describe as extrajudicial killing. You know, when you look into the context of how Bahrain allowed itself to repress go back in 2011, it was one of the most peaceful movements in the entire Arab world. You talk about almost 50% of the entire nation protested against the ruling family. They are a corrupt ruling family holding the full power, abusing their citizens. And this is what the people stand up for. They stand up for a greater share of the power, democracy, and the rule of law and the human rights. These are the concepts.
Okay, so let me ask Mohammed. Mohammed, do you support the right of ordinary Bahrainis who usually happen to be Shia, might have some sort of affiliation with Iran in the sense that they might like Iran, right? Do you support their right to stand up and protest against their government without getting any operational connections or links from Tehran?
I mean, sure. I mean, but that's not my concern here. I'm somebody who's focused on these networks that are in the region. People calling for their rights, people who have an affinity for one country or another, are different than people that are involved in terrorism and terrorist activities. If you look at Sarai al-Ashtar, for example, they claimed credit for 79 attacks. If you look at Sarai al-Mukhtar, 257 attacks since 2013. These are IEDs. These are people that are being killed in the streets in Bahrain by these groups.
Is it plausible that the government is using this, Sarai al-Mukhtar, as a pretext to clamp down on legitimate dissent? So, for example, Rajab tweets criticizing the Saudi-led war in Yemen that leads him to, or has him ending up in jail.
Is that why he's in jail? Because he criticized the Yemen?
That's part of his charges, yes. That's part of the charges.
I told you, I haven't read the verdict, but if that's part of the charges...
I mean, he's been under scrutiny for a long, long time. Links to Iran from the government, right? For example, okay, come in, Saeed Ahmed Al-Wadai. You can speak more definitively and authoritatively on Nabil Rajab's case and the context.
Yes, certainly. I could read out some of the tweets which Nabil tweeted. So just to break down what happened with Nabil. Nabil got sentenced to 2 years over what they call it for conducting TV interviews, which he stated Bahrain, the justice system in Bahrain is corrupt and is pretty much controlled by the authorities or by the government. For this reason, Nabil gets 2-year sentence. Now he is facing additional 15 years imprisonment. 15 years for what the government says, spreading false news during wartime. And precisely they focused on his tweets in relation to the war in Yemen and in relation to exposing torture in Bahrain. For those charges, he's facing up to 15 years imprisonment, and his next trial is due in February. I believe it's on 6th of February. So I just wanted to read out one of the tweets which Nabil posted on his Twitter, and these are part of the charges. Children have been killed. I'm quoting here. Children have been killed by an airstrike on UN refugee camp in Yemen. And he put a link. And then at least 6 civilians burned to death in further airstrike overturned. A tweet of a link by Amnesty International. A retweet by the UNICEF in relation to the Saudi bombardment in Yemen. And stating the war would bring misery.
So, okay, let me get Mohammed to respond to that. Sorry to interrupt you. So, I mean, that's any normal person on Twitter, right? Is that fair? Is my question.
Are these tweets the reason that he's imprisoned?
They're used as part of the prosecution, yes.
Is this I mean, if we can look in the verdict and speak about that, that would make more sense. But I'm not going to defend
but again, this is going to be embarrassing for you because
a verdict that I haven't read.
Okay, but again, you knew we were going to talk also about.
If it is the case that he tweeted an article and went to prison,
but you knew we were going to talk about
problematic.
This as well. And you sat down and you agreed to this interview as well. So just sort of claiming, I haven't read the definitive verdict, I haven't read the judge's notes. This is what happened, right? So I'm asking again, it's used usually against the background of, and the arguments have been made by the government, that these are Iranians influenced. Hold on just for a second here, because we have an issue with the Skype connection when you interrupt, right, Ahmed? So the pretext is being used that Rajab and others are being used as Iranian agents. And my question to you again is, all of this might be true that there's Iranian influence in Bahrain, but it doesn't really help their cause if they're throwing people in jail for tweets that criticize the Saudi-led campaign in Yemen, or they're throwing people in jail for criticizing torture. How does that help anyone?
If that is actually the case, then I do agree with you. But there are human rights defenders or people that masqueraded as human rights defenders that are in jail, not in Bahrain, but they're in jail in the United Kingdom, where there are proven, where there's proven evidence of them having spreadsheets on logistics, things like terror financing, things like manuals to create improvised explosive devices. People like Abdul Rauf al-Shaiber, one of these people. If you want to see, these are the Facebook posts from Sarai al-Ashtar that they claim attacks from. One of them is a long-winded condolence letter to Hezbollah after the death of Imad Mughniya.
So then let's get a response from Ahmed. Ahmed, very finally, does it hurt the cause of Nabil and others who claim to be fighting for legitimate democratic rights that the Iranians have injected themselves into Bahrain?
Look, the context is very simple, and this is what triggered the 2011. It's people, it's part of the Arab Spring, and the Bahrainis had their own chapter in that, and we've seen how much the Saudis, which was the biggest problem, the Saudis, which crashed the democratic movement in 2011. It wasn't the Iranian who marched in the state. The one which continue to be appearing are the most influential when it comes into the crackdown on the Bahraini citizens. I'm talking about systematic torture. This is not a word by the gentleman which you are receiving here. This is the word by the United Nations. In May last year, the Committee Against Torture concluded that there is widespread torture in Bahrain, and they stated that there is a widespread acceptance by the judges in Bahrain to accept torture confessions. There is a problem. Human Rights Watch, when they describe the justice system in the country, they call it a system of injustice, because it's all designed to basically to crash dissent. It's just a political tool the government is using it. My real question is not about, don't talk about Iran as a real context where you have an abusive government that has just unlawfully executed 3 men. I'm talking about an unprecedented level of number of individuals which got their citizenship revoked. I am one of those individuals, which my citizenship got revoked simply because I dared to criticize the king, or I dared to protest against the king. My family has been targeted for this, and that is the real situation. So the real situation is when someone gets arrested, they should have their full rights. If you torture, if you arrest people and you claim that they are affiliated with Iran, why the hell do you torture them to hell?
Okay.
Why do you torture them and then later on execute them? They have
these are all good points.
Citizens, and they should have a fair trial, and their human rights must be respected.
These are all strong points, yeah. and I thank you both for joining us here on the Newsmakers.
We expect the Chinese authorities to immediately release Mr. Gui Minhai from detention and to allow him to reunite with his family, to get consular support and medical support in line with his rights, because as you underlined, he's a Swedish citizen and thereby also a citizen of the European Union.
Last year, a bookseller in Hong Kong by the name of Gui Minhai went missing. He reappeared in Chinese custody, detained for apparently selling books critical of the Communist Party. He was then eventually let go, only to disappear again, and then to reappear. And you can guess what happens next. Police in China have once again arrested Gui. Reports say he was on a train going to Beijing and was in the company of Swedish diplomats. Well, for more on this, let's talk to Xu Qinduo in Beijing. He's a political analyst at China Radio International. And in Hong Kong, political scientist and democracy activist Joseph Cheng. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Xu Qinduo, incredible audacity from the Chinese. He was with Swedish diplomats when they took him. Why was he such a threat?
No, first of all, I don't see there's any connection between his being taken away and being in front of the two diplomats. Remember, diplomats enjoy the diplomatic immunity, but not him. He probably broke the Chinese law many years ago, and he served 2 years in prison terms, starting from late 2015 until late last year. And it's not about audacity, taking him away. Obviously, the Chinese police have their own reason. So far, it's not clear yet. But I think the best way to defend him right now probably is to hire a lawyer instead of criticizing China or ask for immediate release from the Chinese.
Okay, so Joseph Cheng, hire a lawyer. Maybe they have a good reason for taking him.
Well, there is, of course, the issue of the rule of law, since the Chinese authorities has been preaching the advocacy of the rule of law. There's also the issue of China's international prestige, international image and reputation. Apparently, the Chinese authorities are willing to pay the price, so to speak, so as to create a deterrence effect against publishers publishing anything which are disrespectful or dangerous to the reputation of Chinese leaders. Apparently, some people thought that lower-ranking public security officials took Gui from Thailand to China without the knowledge of someone higher up. But since the issue has been defended by the official media, like the Global Times, so it is quite obvious that the Chinese authorities at the highest ranks are aware of the incident.
Interesting. Yeah, Xu Qinduo, the foreign ministry had said, we have no idea what you're talking about, but Chinese state media has defended the arrest. What do you make of that point by Joseph Cheng, that China doesn't really care? This guy can be from Hong Kong, he can be a publisher from Hong Kong, he can be a Swedish citizen as well, but if he criticizes the Communist Party, he's going to jail. That seems to be the message.
No, obviously that's a wrong message. It's not the message. If you look for criticism against the Chinese government or against the particular Chinese leaders, just go visit the Chinese social media like WeChat, like Weibo. You would find tons of them. And a few people got arrested simply for criticizing the Chinese government. I agree with Joseph. This is really about let's say order, law and order of the society, of the country. I know Mr. Gui is a Swedish citizenship, but the citizenship doesn't have much to do with his being arrested or his being detained, his being imprisoned. We were talking about back in 2003, he was drunk, he was driving, he killed a college girl. And then in 2015, and he was detained, he was arrested and put into prison to serve his prison term of 2 years. And he was released late last year. So that's the case. And I think, the Chinese policemen, they have something better to do than doing nothing, going around just harass Mr. Gui instead of others.
Joseph Cheng, what does it say about Hong Kong, where you are, and your autonomy and your legal separation from China, given that a Hong Kong publisher can be nabbed on the mainland?
We are very concerned with incidents like this because Gui was taken from Thailand to China, while even though he claims to have Swedish citizenship. At the same time, some of the colleagues of Mr. Gui in Hong Kong, they were also taken by mysterious people from Hong Kong to China. And it was also rather scary from our point of view that these arrests or these detainees had to admit their guilt in front of the central television camera. Where are the basic rights of detainees? Even according to the criminal procedural law of China, there are strict stipulations as to the extent of detention before trial. There are strict stipulations to the announcement of the alleged crime, of the actual prosecution of the detainees. There are protective measures allowing the detainees' families to visit them, as well as their rights, the detainees' rights to employ lawyers to help their defense. Obviously, all these rights stipulated in the Chinese criminal law, in the Chinese criminal procedural law, have been violated. And this is scary to the people of Hong Kong, as well as doing important damage to the reputation of China.
Okay, gentlemen, unfortunately, time is our great enemy. I have to wrap. I would have loved to have continued with this conversation, but I thank you very much for joining us. And that's all for this edition of The Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. You can check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Remember to like, follow, and subscribe. Next time, our exclusive interview with ousted Brazilian President Dilma Rousseff. We ask her why she thinks she was impeached. Until then, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.